Welcome everybody. Welcome to Focal Points. I'm Ralph Barker. This is Laura McCullough, and today she's Pastor Laura McCullough. We're going to talk about that. You know, the Bible talks about women and their roles and men and their roles, and there's a big controversy that's been going on for probably 2,000 years about the role of women in the church.
Yes.
So I thought I would start out by just sharing the scripture, "Thou shalt be no women pastors." Thank you very much for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed the show.
What was that verse, Ralph?
I made it up. I'm sorry.
So that's something that's interesting. So that everyone knows, so that our viewers know, we talk back and forth about our history and different things and the difference in our beliefs. But one of the things we haven't, I don't know that we've actually articulated. So my husband and I serve in ministry together. And I am actually an ordained pastor and functioning in that capacity. And that is something that we have had numerous questions over the years.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that we've had tons and tons of, both positive and negative feedback about. And it's something that we've been asked to talk about. We're actually investigating this as a leadership team in our ministry, just because some of our leadership team has been brought up with a different understanding, and we're making sure that everyone is on the same page with our understanding of scripture. And that's sort of where this started, because we've been asked to discuss this on Focal Points numerous times.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say I have been resistant to do it as a video, only because it is such a big topic. It's very, very hard to do in a small amount of time, but it's also important enough to really talk about. So,
and she did her homework. She's got all these notes. She researched it. I mean, she always does. And just kind of play the, I don't like to say the devil's advocate, but just to
we can call it that.
Just,
that's fine.
just bring up, what people typically bring up when
Yes.
we talk about this. They'll say, well, Paul said women should be silent in the church, and it's hard to be silent if you're a pastor. And I don't allow women to teach men.
Yes.
Those are two main scriptures, I think, in Timothy. In fact, I had it all on my phone, and I realized my phone's up there recording this, and I can't read my notes. So those are the two that come up right away, basically. And then you go, and there's also, I was thinking about this before we came on, there's I guess a chemistry type thing too, that, women typically are more emotional. They are, and they deal with things that men don't, like PMS. I mean, that's a problem that can
Childbirth and premature
childbirth. I mean, all the things that y'all go through. And I'll be honest, I don't want to be a woman. But I've already prayed to God and said, if the reincarnation is true, I don't want to come back as a woman. So
I think we talked about that on another video. We'll find that was less offensive than the first time you said it, I think.
Less offensive. That's just a preference.
So, and Ralph is right. There are a lot of factors that get brought into this discussion. Some of them are more relevant than others. And one of he was talking about the notes that I have. So the scriptures that he mentioned are the ones that are primarily used. You will not find scriptures quoted regarding this issue that are not Paul's scriptures, because there is actually no mention of women being allowed to be in this role or not outside of Paul's writings. So what I have is it is research, but it's also not. This is kind of a compilation of the questions that I've asked as we've studied this out. So in the beginning, when my husband and I have been in ministry 15 years. When my husband Justin was ordained, he was ordained before I was, and it was something that we got approached about being ordained together as we went forward in some areas of our ministry, as far as particularly pastoring a congregation, because our elders are of the belief that if a man and wife are not serving in echad, or in unity, and really both pouring into that it becomes a huge burden on one or the other, particularly if that's not one spouse is calling over the other. And it was just something, we were asked to consider. And I resisted it at first for the exact reason that it is such a controversial thing, because I never want it to be a stumbling block to anyone. I never want it to be something that overshadows what we're doing in ministry. But the more we considered it, ultimately, one of the other questions regarding women in ministry is right order of headship within both ministry and the home. And in my home, I was resisting my husband's instructions because it was my husband's preference and discernment regarding the scriptures that I should be ordained alongside him. So that's one of the things that's one of the reasons I resisted doing it as a video, because when my husband and I talk about this, it sounds really good for my husband to be the one doing the talking regarding this, as opposed to me sort of defending, who and what I am and I'm doing. And so that was one of those reasons.
Yeah, I'm not taking a position on this. I'm just merely,
Yes.
again, playing the devil's advocate
Sharing
at some
the
point, so we can share this.
Yes.
And I know
Which
this
is a good thing.
this is an evolving, I don't like the word evolving, but it is an evolving culture.
Yes.
And I'm not sure, I think that you make the argument at some point that some of this about women in the churches was cultural and not something to go through time with.
To some degree, and that's what I was saying. This is a list of questions. It's questions and some things that support it. And so just like we normally do, we've told you guys we don't want to teach you what you should think. We want to get you thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And
Exactly.
many people have a hardline preconceived answer to this question. Are women allowed to be pastors? Are women allowed to serve in leadership and teach? Now, and in reality, these are separate things, because one of the things we can talk about sometime, we'll do a video on the fivefold ministry. Pastor and teacher are two separate listed categories out of the fivefold ministry given in Scripture. They are not actually the same thing. And so it becomes a question. But then Paul does mention, he says, I do not allow a woman to teach or be an authority. He does not use the word pastor. So,
But a pastor would be an authority.
It would be. And this is one of the things that gets into the question, what is a pastor? Because one of the other supports that's given, aside from, and I'm getting out of order on my notes, but it doesn't matter. One of the things, other than those verses in Timothy, that's given specifically is people will say, you see no example of a female pastor in Scripture. Well, you don't actually see an example of a male pastor in Scripture either. The word pastor is never used. You have deacon and elder, which translate as overseer. You have this concept of shepherd in that fivefold ministry when it talks about that. So the question becomes, is pastor an office or a calling? And can the callings and giftings of God be limited to gender? Because if pastor is an office, we can discuss who is qualified to fill it. If pastor is a calling, so the fivefold ministry, do we consider prophet to be something you qualify for? Do we consider, do you see what I'm saying? Do we consider evangelist, is evangelism an office or a gifting? A calling.
Yeah.
And are we allowed to say who is and is not qualified for a calling? Because it says the giftings and callings of God cannot be revoked.
Exactly. And it's funny, you're making me think. No, I mean, that's an interesting point about calling versus office. And you're right, I don't remember any reference to pastor in the Scripture. And elders, I mean, some churches rule with elders, and one may be a teaching elder, which might be a pastor, and the other might be one that's more administrative, and there may be one that's more this or that. Because
they function in a gift and calling.
Yes.
In an office. So the office of elder or overseer functions in their gifting, and pastor is listed with the giftings, not the offices. And so one of the questions we've begun to ask is this structure that we're discussing a biblical structure, not to tear apart the whole structure of the church, but to question how we're assigning these roles and what we're basing that on.
And what about hierarchies in the sense of scriptural patterns? Adam found a helpmeet to help him, and then the husband is the head of the family, and the wife is to submit to her husband.
Yes.
So again, we got authority. Same thing with angels. There's a hierarchy of angels. So there's order in everything that God does.
And we agree with that 100%, and that's the way that we operate our household. But we also understand the word helper to be ezer kenegdo, which is in the Scriptures, that's what ezer kenegdo means, counterpart. It means the helper basically who balances, and so ezer being help and kenegdo being that balance, and that.
Well, if you're married, and you are, and I am, we need our mates to balance us, because men especially, we're blind to things. We can't, I can't find the peanut butter. My wife is right there in front of you. That's men.
Well, and we as women, and I will acknowledge something that Ralph said. Ralph talked about the component about women being emotional. I will say that there are times that phrase is used in a very intentionally or unintentionally derogatory way toward whether or not women are qualified to serve in a leadership capacity. But we are by nature nurturers. We are more empathetic. We tend to be more sensitive in those ways. But it's a gift. It's something that's a blessing. And in operating within those roles, we flourish in the way that God created us to do. But in regard to authority and hierarchy, we have to be very conscious that yes, we are operating in a biblical structure, but we also have to consider the words of Christ and the words in Revelation, because Christ says that the Gentiles lord over one another, and it shall not be so among you. And it also says, and that's regarding the structure of ministry and the structure of the church specifically, because the disciples were talking about who is the greatest. And then in Revelation, it talks about that Yahweh hates Nicolaitanism. Nicolaitanism, that's an entirely separate, that's a teaching on that word, but Nikolaos, it literally means victory over the people. So it's a hierarchical structure where those in authority are given more value than those that they're serving. And so we have to be conscious of not establishing the value. And that's one of the questions that I asked. So in a second, we'll just kind of read through the questions, because are we talking about authority and office, or are we talking about value of personhood? Because if being emotional or functioning in the way that God made us to function, childbirth and the other things that Ralph mentioned, disqualifies us from something, it begins in certain conversations to be an issue of value of personhood, not qualification for office. And some of that is completely contrary to the biblical examples and historical examples that we have.
Well, by the way, I have a fairly big feminine side. Like when I get lost, I ask for directions. So,
massive. This just massive femininity to ask for directions. I was waiting to see where that one went, y'all.
I do, though. I cannot stand to
and
be
he
lost.
loves cats. If any of you are on his Facebook page, it's like 70% cats. I'm beginning to wonder, are you qualified to pastor?
With cats? Oh my God.
Well, pastoring can be like herding cats at times.
You know what I think we ought to do, actually? I think we ought to do a part 2 of this.
Okay.
Because we already used so much time today. We like to keep these kind of short. So we're going to come back.
Ralph likes to keep these short.
Yeah, try to keep them short.
At me.
I know people that don't have any time,
Yes.
What do you call it?
So what I can do is I'm going to, we'll leave the questions. I'm going to read a quote, and then we'll leave the questions. And on the second half of this video, we'll go through those questions.
Perfect,
okay.
Perfect.
So this is a quote by M.A. Milton. Now, interestingly, M.A. Milton is an author and theologian who is not for women serving in a pastoral capacity.
Okay.
But he wrote an excellent paper examining the problems with that stance. And this was what he said. He said, "We need to recognize out of the gate that men and women of goodwill disagree on this topic. We must not break our faith in bonds of unity, even if we are convinced or convicted that our position is ultimately the right one. This is not an issue of chauvinism or discrimination. It is an issue of biblical interpretation, because there is nowhere that a woman serving in this capacity is listed as sin. It is an advisement by Paul in his writings. God has accommodated our humanity by allowing branches of his church to exist where polarized positions may be expressed with love. Those men who employ in a heart of misogyny this scripture as a weapon to keep female parishioners from exercising their God-ordained gifts are wrong and should be called out by other men in this case. They will be seen for what they are by the world and ultimately by the church." What this is saying is a biblical interpretation of the appropriate roles of women in ministry is a discussion we should all have. Wielding this as a weapon of misogyny, as Milton is saying, is something that is an issue of sin. So while we are not told anywhere in the scriptures defining sin that a woman serving in an office is such, we are told that to have a heart of oppression or discrimination, so it is that this becomes a heart issue. And so we need to be very conscientious. And I will qualify that as well, that a woman seeking a position for reasons of control or manipulation or out of the wrong heart is also a sin.
That'd be true with a man too.
Yes. And so this becomes a heart issue as well as a biblical interpretation issue, and we have to separate those two things as we do this discussion. So
good point. When we come back, we're going to do part 2, and we're going to answer the question or go through the questions that Laura has. So stay with us. God bless. See you next time.